What if the fastest way to build an empire had nothing to do with swinging a sword? What if it meant simply letting every starving stranger at your gate walk in and eat, no questions asked? It sounds like charity dressed up in good intentions. It runs, underneath, like the coldest and most brilliant business plan this continent has ever produced. His name on paper was Lorien Bohemia, a disgraced young noble tossed out by his own family. He had been dumped on the ragged edge of nowhere and left to rot there quietly. But the mind looking out through those eyes belonged to someone else entirely. He was a man from another world, one who understood something no medieval baron had ever bothered to learn: numbers. For a long moment he simply lay there, staring at unfamiliar rafters, trying to reconcile two lifetimes of memory crowding the same skull. He opened his eyes to mud walls sweating with damp, a roof leaking rust-colored water onto the floorboards. The smell hit him before anything else did, a body that had gone weeks without washing, sour and thick in the small room. Straw poked through a thin mattress, and somewhere outside a dog barked itself hoarse at nothing in particular. Greywood Town, his new inheritance, was less a settlement and more a slow-motion funeral procession. 836 people lived there, and every single one of them wore the same hollow, waiting look. It was the look of people counting down the days rather than living through them. A crow picked at something in the frozen dirt near the gate, undisturbed by the handful of guards too tired to chase it off. Fields around the walls sat cracked and half-plowed, furrows abandoned halfway through as if the farmers had simply given up mid-stroke. Thatched roofs sagged under years of neglect, and smoke rose thin and gray from chimneys that had too little fuel to spare. Somewhere nearby a child coughed, dry and rattling, the sound carrying easily through walls too thin to hold in warmth. An old steward named Ball shuffled in to greet him, joints cracking, eyes already dimmed with low expectations. Ball expected nothing from this exiled boy but one more mouth clamoring for scraps off an already dying land. He bowed out of habit more than respect, the gesture worn thin from decades of serving nobles who never noticed him at all. Then a voice only Lorien could hear sliced straight through his skull, cold, flat, and mechanical. It welcomed him to something calling itself the Territory Lord system, as if that explained anything at all. The terms were almost insultingly simple: 1 silver coin, every single morning at 6 a.m., for every living person registered under his name. Lorien sat with that thought the way a gambler sits with a winning hand nobody else at the table can see. His pulse ticked up despite himself, the strange mechanical voice somehow more convincing than anything he had heard in his old life. 836 people meant 836 silver coins a day, so long as every last one of them stayed alive to be counted. He was still turning the number over in his mind when a scream cut through the yard outside. An old farmer collapsed in the dirt, knees buckling first, then his whole body folding flat onto his face. The system chimed instantly, a small cold sound with no mercy in it at all. The population ticked down in front of his eyes, 836 sliding to 835. Lorien did not see a dying man crumpled in the mud. He saw a cancelled paycheck, and the distinction terrified even him for a half a second. He screamed at the guards to save the man, his voice cracking with a panic that had nothing to do with compassion. It had everything to do with arithmetic, and he knew it even as the words left his mouth. The guards dragged the old farmer inside, forcing water and broth down his throat past his clenched teeth. His eyelids fluttered once, then again, and a low groan escaped him as color crept back into his lips. By some miracle the old man held on, chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged pulls. Lorien stood over him afterward, breathing hard, sweat cooling on the back of his neck. He made a declaration in that moment that would define his rule from that day forward. "No one dies on his land without his permission," he said, and he meant it in a way nobody around him understood yet. The villagers who heard it thought their new lord had simply lost his mind. They whispered behind cupped hands that grief had cracked something loose in him overnight. They mistook a spreadsheet obsession for something closer to mercy, and had no idea the two were about to become exactly the same thing. Baal, watching from the doorway, wondered privately whether he was now serving a fool or a man about to remake the entire town from nothing. He kept that thought to himself, the way he had kept most thoughts to himself under the previous lord's rule. The next morning, Lorien tore up every tax his predecessor had ever levied, all in one motion, ink barely dry on the old ledgers. He claimed a hidden family fortune, a convenient lie built to explain what was coming next. Nobody in Greywood questioned it aloud, too grateful for the coming change to care where any of it had actually come from. Ball was sent to Red Leaf City with a wagon and a shopping list scrawled in Lorien's own unfamiliar handwriting. White flour, salted pork, salt, bolts of real cloth, things Greywood had not tasted or touched in a generation. That night, for the first time anyone in the town could remember, hot food waited at the gate, and it was free. White bread still warm enough to steam in the cold air, meat porridge thick enough to stand a spoon upright in. People who had forgotten what a full stomach even felt like started crying before they had taken a single bite. Some genuinely fainted where they stood, bodies unable to process that this was real and not some cruel trick about to be yanked away. Children pressed their faces close to the steaming pots, breathing in the smell of pork fat and boiled grain like it might vanish if they blinked. An old woman near the back kept touching her bowl with 2 fingers, as if checking it would still be there a second later. Steam curled up from the pots into the cold night air, carrying the smell of pork fat past the outer edges of the crowd. Lorien stood at the gate and told them plainly, "From now on, food is free for life, to every citizen of this land." The crowd's loyalty spiked so hard that the invisible system readout in his mind seemed to hum with quiet satisfaction. In his own head, though, Lorien was not thinking about gratitude at all. He was looking out at 835 people and calculating exactly how much fuel his new machine could burn. The number sat behind his eyes all through dinner, refusing to let him think about anything else for long. The next morning arrived, gray light through cracked shutters, and with it came the first true test of the voice in his skull. At exactly 6 a.m., silver coins rained down onto his bed in a metallic hailstorm. 835 coins, cold, heavy, and undeniably real, bounced off the blanket and rolled across the floor. He sat in that pile laughing, not with pure joy exactly, but with the dizzy certainty of a man who has found the cheat code to an entire world. If population meant income, then population was the only investment worth making, full stop. He said it out loud once, quietly, just to hear how strange it sounded coming from the mouth of a nobleman. Before he could even enjoy the thought properly, Ball burst through the door with worse news than Lorien had expected. 3,000 to 4,000 refugees were marching toward Greywood, thrown off Red Leaf's land like unwanted cargo. They had been whipped away from the border the way a farmer chases stray dogs off his fields. Every neighboring lord was shooting refugees on sight rather than let them strain already thin food stores. Bale wanted the gates barred and the walls reinforced long before that starving tide arrived at their doorstep. He argued that Greywood barely had enough grain for its own 800, let alone thousands of strangers dragging misery behind them. His voice rose with each objection, though Lorien had already turned toward the stables before he finished the sentence. Lorien did the exact opposite. He ordered wagons loaded with food and rode out to the border himself, cloak snapping in the wind. If Red Leaf did not want these people, Greywood would take every single one of them, and gladly at that. Among the refugees limped a broken old soldier named Gareth, missing a leg from a war against orcs years earlier. He carried his 5-year-old granddaughter on his back the whole way, because her small legs could no longer keep up. A Red Leaf cavalry captain named Carl rode past the column, sneering openly at the sight of an exiled noble playing savior with wagons of soup. He called Lorien a penniless disgrace, certain this whole gesture would collapse within a week, maybe less. His men laughed along, spitting into the mud at the sight of ragged serfs stirring a pot meant for a king's table. The refugees themselves would not come closer at first, wary and flinching, certain this had to be some kind of trap. They assumed free food meant chains waiting underneath it or something worse still. Children clung to their mother's skirts, too weak to cry properly, their ribs visible through torn cloth. An old man leaned on a cane fashioned from a broken spear shaft, eyes fixed on the wagons rolling closer across the field. Then the guards cracked open the food pots, and the smell of real meat and bread rolled across the frozen field like a wave. It broke over every last one of their defenses at once, and hunger did what words never could. One man dropped his walking staff without noticing, already moving toward the smell before his mind caught up with his feet. There was no parchment for names out there in the open field, so a soldier pressed each person's thumb into charcoal. He stamped the mark onto a wooden board instead, one crude line at a time. Gareth stepped forward first, dragging his granddaughter by the hand, and pressed his thumb down before his fear could talk him out of it. Lorien personally ladled soup into his bowl, steam curling up between them, and looked him dead in the eye. He told him he was home now, 2 words that landed harder than any speech could have. Gareth's granddaughter peered over his shoulder at the bowl, too shy to speak but too hungry to look away from it. Gareth broke down sobbing right there in the mud, swearing his life to a man he had known for less than a minute. His granddaughter tugged at his sleeve, confused by the tears, until he scooped her up and pressed a piece of bread into her small hands. Behind him, the entire crowd surged forward at once, thousands of feet trampling toward the wagons like a dam had finally given way. Wooden bowls clattered against each other, ladles scraped iron pots, and for the first time in weeks the field filled with something close to laughter. Even Carl's soldiers, standing off to one side, exchanged uneasy glances at a scene none of them had a name for yet. Carl watched the stampede with open contempt curling his lip. He warned anyone who would listen that these people would turn on their new lord the moment the food ran dry. His own men shrugged the comment off, too busy counting how many escort fees this endless line of refugees might be worth. Lorien barely registered the insult, because he'd already heard something far more useful. Another 1 to 2,000 refugees, too old or too weak to walk, were dying slowly in ditches along the border. So he made Karl an offer instead of an enemy: 5 copper coins for every living refugee his men delivered to Greywood's gate. Karl's soldiers, who felt nothing for the dying strangers they had abandoned days earlier, agreed instantly, smelling easy coin. Bol, watching the tally of mouths climb hour by hour, was quietly panicking about how any of this could possibly be sustained. Lorien did not share the fear at all. In his mind, every ragged stranger stumbling through the gate was simply another silver coin walking in on 2 legs. He watched the line stretch past the horizon and felt something close to hunger himself, though not for food. That night, over 3,400 refugees ringed the town in bonfires that cracked and spat sparks into the dark. They ate hot food for the first time in longer than most of them could even remember. Gareth, unasked, volunteered for night watch, standing guard on a leg he did not have out of sheer gratitude. He propped himself against a wagon wheel, spear across his knees, and refused every offer to be relieved before dawn. His granddaughter slept curled against his good leg, and he kept one hand resting on her shoulder through the entire watch. Lorien barely slept that night, running the same fear on a loop behind his eyes. If even a fraction of these fragile people died before morning, what would that do to tomorrow's count? 6 a.m. came, and the system delivered its verdict with brutal, clinical clarity. Population 4,247, 0 deaths overnight. 4,247 silver coins detonated onto his floor, overturning furniture and burying his boots to the ankle. Lorien stood in the wreckage of his own bedroom and started laughing again, quieter this time. It was the laugh of a man watching a fortune build itself brick by brick while he slept. Coins had rolled under the bed, into his boots, into the folds of his blanket, and he simply let them lie there for a while. He told himself he was simply protecting his market, nothing more, nothing sentimental about it. The truth sat closer to worship, the worship of a number that kept climbing. He sent Bol out again with instructions to buy timber, stone, thatch, cloth, and medicine. Enough, he specified, to shelter thousands before winter closed its fist around the region. Bol read the list twice before setting off, muttering about numbers he had never once handled in his entire career as a steward. The gears of Greywood's transformation had already started turning, and nothing about them was going to slow down now. Word spread through the refugee camps that this lord kept his promises, and the tone of the whispers around the fires began to shift. Even the wariest among them started speaking of Greywood the way one speaks of luck too good to question closely. Lorien called every soul in Greywood together, old serfs and new refugees standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. He wanted to announce a construction project on a scale none of them had ever imagined, let alone witnessed. The crowd braced for the only version of labor they had ever known: forced work, no pay, back spent under a lord's whip. Instead, Lorien announced wages: 2 copper coins a day, plus 3 full meals for anyone willing to build. The silence that followed was not disbelief exactly. It was the sound of people quietly rewriting everything they thought they understood about nobility. A few in the back exchanged glances, waiting for the catch they were certain had to be hiding somewhere in the offer. Gareth found his voice first, shouting to the crowd that this lord actually meant to pay them for their labor. The disbelief cracked wide open into wild, unrestrained joy that rippled outward through the crowd. Within minutes, people were grabbing crude axes and stone tools, sprinting toward the forest and the quarry. They ran as if the offer might vanish into smoke if they hesitated even a moment. Dust kicked up behind them in a ragged cloud, boots slapping against half-frozen mud all the way to the tree line. At the quarry, Gareth worked to his own exhaustion beside a young farmhand named Pete. Both men kept glancing sideways at each other, convinced they had to be sharing the same dream. Bol ran a wage line at the end of each shift, counting out coins against the stone and timber each worker had hauled. Gareth received his first wage in years, bit down on the coin to check it was real, and wept openly when it did not bend. Pete simply pressed his coins to his lips, kissing the metal like it was a saint's relic pulled from a chapel wall. By dusk, timber frames for a dozen new houses already stood along the eastern road, pale wood catching the last light of the day. Children raced between the skeletal frames, claiming rooms that did not exist yet with confidence only children can manage. Then Karl returned, hauling the remaining 2,050 refugees behind him like unwanted freight. They arrived half-starved and barely clothed, and Karl called the whole miserable delivery a gift. Bol's face went white at the sight of that many more mouths arriving all at once. He started scribbling a new tally on a scrap of parchment, hand shaking slightly with each fresh addition. Lorien paid Karl 100 silver coins as an escort fee without a flicker of hesitation. Then, without missing a beat, he invited Carl to bring 10,000 more if he could ever find that many. Population climbed to 6,297, and the 6 a.m. payout became a literal avalanche of metal. It collapsed his table under its own weight, coins spilling across the floorboards in every direction. That surge came with a smell Lorien could not simply calculate away. Thousands of unwashed bodies packed together, some of them genuinely convinced that bathing invited demons into the skin. Fear of disease hit him harder than fear of bandits ever had. Sickness did not care about his silver coin income at all, and that terrified him more than any blade could. He paced the length of his room twice before sitting down to write the order out himself. He issued an order on the spot: latrines dug downwind of the town, mandatory nightly bathing, and ration cuts for anyone who refused. Gareth grumbled that squatting behind a bush had been tradition since his grandfather's grandfather walked this land. Then Lorien pointed out, flatly, that his granddaughter's life depended on clean water. Gareth became the order's most zealous enforcer almost overnight, chasing down stragglers himself. He took to inspecting fingernails and hairlines with the same seriousness he had once given to weapon drills. Word of the town's strange new customs reached Red Leaf City eventually, carried by gossiping traders. A fat, shrewd merchant named Hobby rode out expecting to find a plague pit worth picking clean for scrap. Instead, he found refugees digging neat, orderly trenches he first mistook for mass graves. He realized only after asking that they were sewers, dug on purpose, well ahead of any disaster striking. Hobby crouched at the edge of one trench, poking the packed clay walls with his walking cane, muttering that no surf town he knew planned this far ahead. Lorien bought 500 bolts of linen and 1,000 bars of lard soap on the spot, paying in full. He did not haggle over a single coin, which unsettled Hobby more than any argument would have. He dumped 3,000 silver coins into Hobby's hands, then added a 10 gold coin deposit against whatever came next. Hobby actually dropped to one knee, stunned by a payment that size from a man the whole city assumed was destitute. He swore to bring back every scrap of soap, cloth, salt, and medicine his warehouses could possibly spare. He rode off calling Lorien the strangest and most profitable customer he had met in 20 years of trading. Population crept to 6,301. But Lorien's own spending was starting to worry him more than any invading army could. A ruined exile flashing that much coin around was exactly the kind of detail that got noticed by the wrong people. He turned the problem over that night, chewing on it the way he once chewed on quarterly reports in another life entirely. So he built a story, letting it slip through Hobby that he had quietly sold off a family heirloom on the black market. He also started spreading his payments across dozens of worn, mismatched coins through multiple merchants. That way, no single ledger anywhere would ever show the true size of his growing fortune. Hiding the money was only half the plan taking shape in his head. The other half was already forming. Real soldiers, real steel, a wall no rival could simply walk through uninvited. He sketched rough formations on the back of a supply ledger, crossing out lines and starting over more than once. He halted construction wages for a single day and summoned every able-bodied man between 15 and 40 into an open field. Roughly 1,500 of them stood there, breath fogging in the cold, waiting for an explanation. Fear rippled through the crowd immediately, certain they were about to be conscripted, or worse, exiled all over again. Lorien told them plainly that Red Leaf cavalry patrolled too close for comfort, and bandits were gathering in the hills. Both were a direct threat to the homes they had only just been given, and he did not soften that fact. Fear curdled into resolve fast, the kind that only comes from men who finally have something worth defending. A murmur ran through the field, men glancing at each other, and then, slowly, back at Lorien with something new in their expressions. Gareth stepped forward first again, and was named captain of a new fighting force Lorien called the Iron Guard. Wagons rolled in and were unloaded to reveal hundreds of iron spears, swords, and leather armor stacked in neat rows. These were weapons no ordinary serf town should ever legally possess, and everyone in that field knew it. A few of the older men ran their fingers along the spear edges, testing a sharpness they had not touched since their own war days. 500 men signed on within half an hour, lured by better wages, meat at every meal, and first pick of housing. Pete signed his own name with a shaky charcoal mark, standing straighter the moment a spear was pressed into his hands. 30 miles away, in the tangled dark of Black Pine Forest, a one-eyed bandit chief called Bloodblade commanded roughly 300 outlaws. A bribed stableman brought Bloodblade the same rumor Lorien himself had quietly planted around Red Leaf. The rumor claimed this exile sat on a fortune, guarded by nothing but a rabble of starving refugees. Bloodblade planned a night raid, capture the lord, seize the treasure, kill anyone foolish enough to fight back. His men would take whatever else pleased them along the way, and no one in that camp questioned the plan twice. Bloodblade rehearsed the raid out loud, tracing the route with a dirty finger across a scavenged scrap of map. They sharpened blades around a low fire, boasting about the soft farmers they expected to cut through by morning. Back in Greywood, disaster struck first from the ground itself. A sewer trench collapsed without warning, killing one serf outright and badly injuring another beneath the rubble. Lorien, furious at the lost income before he even fully processed the loss of life, poured every resource he had into saving the survivor. He knelt beside the injured man himself, barking orders for clean bandages and a splint before the man had even stopped screaming. Then, in the dead of night, an alarm horn tore through the town, low and urgent. Every head turned toward the tree line at once, hands reaching for whatever weapon lay closest. Torches went up along the palisade in a ragged line, flame catching from post to post faster than anyone could shout orders. Bloodblade's 300 bandits came charging in, expecting easy prey, farmers with pitchforks, a lord who would beg for his life. Instead they hit hidden stakes buried in the dark ground, wood splintering against flesh in the first seconds. A wall of 500 iron guard spears waited exactly where Gareth had planned it, angled and ready. Pete fought with a savagery no one had seen in him before that night. He screamed with every swing that these bandits would not touch his family's food, not while he still had arms to swing. The serfs did not fight like conscripts dragged into a battle they never chose. They fought like people who finally had something worth dying to keep, and it showed in every blow. Someone screamed a name that was not answered, and the line closed the gap without slowing down. Mud and blood mixed underfoot until the ground itself seemed to shift with every step forward. Lorien himself flanked the bandits with cavalry, driven less by courage than by pure fury at watching his citizens bleed into the dirt. His income was bleeding out right alongside them, and in his head the two things had already merged into one. He drove his horse straight into the flank, blade already swinging before the animal had fully stopped moving. He gave one order that cut through the chaos of steel and screaming: no survivors, except the leader, alive. By 4 in the morning it was over, the field gone quiet except for groaning wounded and settling ash from the bonfires. Of Bloodblade's 300 men, more than 260 lay dead in the churned-up mud. Roughly 30 survivors, Bloodblade among them, were dragged into the town square, hamstrung and bound at the wrists. More than 6,000 watching townspeople pressed in close around the kneeling prisoners, torchlight flickering across their faces. Somewhere in the crowd a child asked her mother what would happen next, and the mother simply pulled her closer without answering. Gareth reported 15 iron guards dead, 8 more wounded, delivering the news like a man bracing for grief. Lorien's mind went somewhere colder in that same instant. 15 fewer silver coins a day, compounding over years into a fortune he would never see. Bloodblade, still defiant despite his ruined legs, offered ransom, treasure, anything to buy his own life back. Lorien told him plainly that no treasure on earth outweighed decades of lost income. He executed him with his own blade in front of the crowd, the motion quick and utterly without ceremony. He wiped the blade clean on Bloodblade's own cloak before turning back to face the watching townspeople. The square erupted, not in horror, but in a roar hailing Lorien as their protector. He was, they shouted, the first lord who had ever bled for them instead of off them. Someone started banging a pot lid like a drum, and within minutes the whole square had turned the aftermath of a massacre into something almost like a celebration. At 6 a.m. the system delivered its final tally on the night's chaos. 16 dead in total, 1 to illness, 15 in battle. Population settled at 6,285. 6,285 silver coins hit his floor, and Lorien stood over the pile already thinking about how to stop this from ever happening again. Ball assumed the roughly 30 surviving bandits would be executed the way custom always demanded. Lorien had a better idea forming, one that made even his own steward uneasy. The system, he realized, counted registered slaves exactly the same as free citizens, 1 silver coin a day, no distinction whatsoever. At sword point he forced a bandit's thumb onto a slave register, ink smearing across trembling skin. The system confirmed it instantly, 1 new citizen added to his count, cold and indifferent to the method. Every surviving bandit was spared execution and sentenced instead to a lifetime in a fenced quarry. Backbreaking labor on rye porridge and the whip, but alive, and alive meant profitable. He explained the reasoning to Baal without a shred of embarrassment, ticking figures off on his fingers as he spoke. The math was obscene and Lorien loved every part of it. Less than half a copper coin of food a day per slave, against nearly 100 copper coins of value in return. From that moment on, any enemy his men captured alive was never simply a threat to be executed. It was a gold mine wearing human skin, and he intended to mine every last one of them. He said as much to Baal over breakfast, spooning porridge without a trace of shame at the comparison. Lorien moved fast on the next weakness he could see stretching across his fledgling territory. 5 blacksmiths and their apprentices were bribed quietly out of Redleaf's black market, along with cheap pig iron bought in bulk. 2,000 brand new iron tools, axes, pickaxes, shovels were handed out free to serfs who had only ever known stone, bone, and rotting wood. He tested the weight of the new axe head twice before swinging, grinning like a boy with a new toy despite his missing leg. Gareth swung a new axe once and felled a pine tree that would have taken him 10 strokes before. Productivity across the town tripled almost overnight, wood piling up faster than anyone could stack it. The ring of new steel against wood became a constant background hum across the whole settlement, morning to dusk. Lorien justified the expense to Baal in the bluntest terms he could manage. Winter would freeze every trade road shut, so the land had to feed and arm itself entirely alone by then. It had cost roughly a week's income across the board. He considered it, without hesitation, the cheapest insurance he would ever buy in his life. Baal simply nodded along by that point, no longer bothering to voice objections he already suspected would lose. At the edge of town, a slave caravan called the Black Crow rolled in, wheels grinding over frozen ruts. Lorien went to inspect the merchandise like a man auditing inventory rather than looking at people. He rejected the sickly ones outright, calculating coldly that a slave too weak to survive would never pay off the cost of feeding them. The trader trailed behind him, rattling off prices, sweating slightly under a gaze that priced people like livestock without any apology for it. Then a caged half-elf woman caught his eye, thin wrists gripping the bars, chin lifted despite everything. She was a botanist named Ella, expelled from the Violet Magic Academy for a paper the church had called heresy. Her crime, as it turned out, was proving that high-temperature composted waste could double wheat yields. That fact alone had offended a world convinced crops grew only by divine will, nothing more. The academy had burned her research papers in a public square, calling the very idea of it an insult to the harvest gods. The trader assumed Lorien wanted her as a concubine and priced her at a laughably low 5 gold coins. Lorien saw something else entirely in her, a mind worth more than any weapon stacked in that caravan. He paid 10 times the asking price without so much as blinking, and the trader nearly tripped over himself thanking him. Ella watched the exchange from inside the cage, bracing for whatever came next with her jaw set hard. He named her, on the spot, right there in the mud, Chief Agricultural Officer of Greywood Town. That evening, Ella braced herself for the worst, warning him flatly she would bite through his throat before letting him touch her. Lorien's answer landed cold and strange in her ears, nothing like what she had steeled herself to hear. He had no interest in her body at all, he said, only in what he called her surplus value, meaning her knowledge. Ella's grip on the bars loosened slightly, though the suspicion in her eyes did not fade nearly as fast. He asked her, plainly, whether her composting theory could get 2,000 acres of winter wheat into the ground before the hard frost hit. Ella warned it would take hundreds of gold coins in tanks, tools, and quality seed to even attempt it. She was certain this so-called exiled baron could never afford numbers that large. She crossed her arms and waited for him to laugh the idea off the way every other noble in her past had done. At 6 a.m., the system answered for him, coins already spilling before she finished her sentence. Population 6,352, 6,352 silver coins hitting the floor in a rolling wave. Lorien dumped the entire pile out in front of her like a magician revealing a trick nobody asked to see. Ella stared at it, certain for one wild moment that he had robbed a royal treasury to make his point. He appointed her Minister of Agriculture with an unlimited budget and turned to leave before she could argue. She stood there staring at the empty doorway for a long moment, still not entirely sure whether she had just been freed or bought outright. Something in her hardened into purpose right then, a private vow to make Greywood soil the richest on the continent. She spent that first night sketching irrigation channels by candlelight, ignoring the ache in her wrists from the caravan's chains. Massive composting tanks rose at the edge of the fields, fermenting waste that Ella swore would become holy soil. Gareth and the other serfs balked at first, certain that spreading filth on farmland would summon plague, not harvest. Lorien walked to the reeking tanks himself, swallowed hard against his own churning stomach, and declared the ground blessed by the god of light. It was a lie built entirely out of desperation, and he knew it even as he said it with a straight face. A few serfs actually knelt right there in the muck, murmuring thanks to a god who had never once helped them before. Then he sweetened the lie with something everyone understood better than scripture ever could: extra salted meat and a copper coin for every 10 cartloads hauled to the fields. Greed did what piety could not manage on its own. Serfs nearly came to blows fighting over who got to shovel manure first that morning. 2 boys wrestled over a single shovel until Baal separated them with a laugh, shaking his head at what coin could turn people into wanting. At the freezing quarry, a bandit called Scarfus Kyle braced for the cruelty he assumed slavery always demanded. Instead he got an extra bowl of hot rye porridge against the cold, steam rising off it in the frosty air. It was a small mercy handed down because Lorien needed strong arms swinging picks, not corpses stacking up in the tunnels. He glanced sideways at the guard who handed him the bowl, waiting for some cruelty to follow, but none ever came. Kyle found himself thinking, uneasily, that this chained life beat starving and hunted in the woods as a free man. 6 a.m. arrived again, coins piling up in a steady, familiar rhythm. Population 6,381, including 34 lifelong slaves, and 6,381 silver coins paid out in full. Lorien ran the numbers with something close to reverence, murmuring them under his breath like a prayer. Under 2 copper coins of food a day was producing 34 silver coins of income, plus free labor breaking stone besides. Just before the first snow fell, hundreds of wooden houses stood finished, roofs freshly thatched against the cold. All 2,000 mu of winter wheat lay planted under Ella's careful hand, rows straight as ruled lines. Heated greenhouses rose from bare earth nearby, glass and linen glinting in the pale light. Smoke from 100 new chimneys drifted low over rooftops each evening, and the smell of roasting meat had replaced the smell of rot entirely. A caravan from the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild arrived next, led by a steward named Mars. He expected to goja broken noble at 5 times the going rate, the way every merchant did with desperate exiles. What he found instead stopped him cold in the middle of the road. Gravel roads, orderly rows of houses, healthy faces turned toward him without a trace of fear. 500 armed iron guards stood in disciplined formation nearby, spear tips catching the winter light. Lorien unloaded 4 wheelbarrows of silver, 40,000 coins and 400 gold, right there in front of Mars. He bought the entire shipment of wheat, sheepskin coats, and salt in a single motion, barely pausing to count. Mars' assistants scrambled to keep up with the tally, quills scratching furiously across their ledgers. Then he demanded something bigger than the goods themselves, something Mars had not expected at all. An exclusive supply contract, covering slaves, refugees, pig iron, and livestock going forward, no exceptions. Mars dropped to his knees right there in the mud and agreed to every single term without argument. He rode back toward the chamber, already composing the report that would make his name inside the guild. Mid-November brought the first blizzard, wind screaming across the plains, the exact kind of storm that killed serfs by the hundreds elsewhere. A woman named Martha woke from a nightmare of frozen bodies stacked in snowdrifts. She opened her eyes to find her family warm instead, a real wooden house holding out the wind entirely. Thick hay bedding, sheepskin coats, and a fireplace crackling while her son Pete grilled meat over the open flame. Pete explained that Lorien had kept paying the Iron Guard, even with construction paused for the storm. He had stockpiled winter supplies for exactly this kind of night, planning months ahead of the weather itself. Martha listened, still half convinced she was dreaming, and reached over to touch the wall just to be sure it was real. Lorien's decree was blunt and strange when it reached every household by runner. Stay indoors, it read, and if anyone dared to freeze to death on his land, he would drag them back from hell himself. Martha wept at the words when she heard them read aloud. She told anyone who would listen that this lord acted more like a god than the church or the duke ever had. Outside, the wind screamed against shuttered windows for 3 straight days without once finding a way in. In the fenced agricultural zone, Ella tended a greenhouse roofed in lard-coated linen, warmed by underground heating flues. Lorien had sketched those flues from memory, half-remembered diagrams from a life nobody here could imagine. Outside, the cold could kill a man within the hour, wind cutting straight through wool and leather alike. Ella kept a hand near the flue vents, adjusting them by feel the way a musician might tune a familiar instrument. Inside, 2 tender wheat seedlings pushed up through dark soil in the dead of winter, a small miracle nobody but Ella truly understood. She insisted, again and stubbornly, that credit belonged to composting and trapped heat, not to any god above. Lorien asked for a projected yield, patient despite the cold biting at his fingers. Ella estimated the greenhouses and buried wheat could feed the entire population for 3 years past spring's first harvest. In his head, Lorien was already past the food itself, running numbers toward 20,000 people. 20,000 people meant 20,000 silver coins a day, and the thought alone kept him warm through the storm. He traced the number onto frosted glass with one finger, watching it fog over and vanish within seconds. He waited for the 6 a.m. settlement after the blizzard the way a man waits for a verdict in a courtroom. He had gambled 40,000 coins on winter supplies alone, and the storm had not shown him mercy in return, only silence. The system delivered a number that had never once happened in this world's recorded history. 0 deaths from the cold, across every registered soul, slave and free alike, without exception. Lorien broke into laughter that carried real triumph in it, echoing off the walls of his own room. Ball, standing beside him, wept openly, certain it could only be divine mercy raining down on them. He kept repeating that no lord in living memory had ever brought a whole population through a blizzard without a single grave to dig. Outside, children who had spent the storm huddled indoors burst into the square, throwing snow at each other for the sheer joy of surviving it. In his own head, Lorien dismissed the miracle as nothing more than self-interest dressed up in kindness. Then he turned that miracle straight into a weapon, ordering Mars to buy dying, frost-bitten refugees from rival territories for pennies on the coin. His target was simple and enormous in scope: push Greywood's population past 10,000, whatever it cost him. Half a month later, Mars returned with 1,200 refugees bought at rock-bottom prices. Hundreds more, he admitted, had died on the road before ever reaching Greywood's gate. Mars delivered the number flatly, no longer flinching at figures that would have horrified him a season earlier. The ones who did arrive were in horrifying shape, frostbite eating at fingers and toes alike. A third of them were feverish and delirious, some showing the telltale signs of dysentery already setting in. The smell of rot clung to the wagons long before they reached the gate, and several guards turned away to retch at their first look inside. Aunt Masha, called in before she had even unpacked her own bags, took one look at the convoy and started barking orders before anyone asked her to. Lorien looked at what was essentially a walking outbreak on wheels, and still saw 1,206 new names on his ledger. But even he understood the math could flip against him just as fast as it had built. One plague could wipe out a healthy population far faster than it had ever been built up. He ran the risk over twice in his head, weighing greed against ruin before settling on a plan that split the difference. He refused to turn a single person away at the gate. Instead, he ordered an emergency quarantine built on the spot, fencing, tents, boiling water, and summoned Ella to help however a botanist could. In the quarantine zone, a refugee girl named Anna sat with feet rotting from frostbite. She waited quietly for the death she had always been told was coming for people like her. Instead, a volunteer called Aunt Masha, leading 300 untrained nurses, scrubbed her wounds with liquor-soaked rags. She cauterized the rot with a heated blade, the smell of it sharp and immediate in the cold tent. Anna bit down on a strip of leather and did not scream, though her knuckles went white around the edge of her cot. Masha wiped the blade clean on her apron and moved straight to the next cot without pausing to catch her breath. Lorien paid every medical worker 3 copper coins a day, with a flour bonus for every patient who survived. He applied instincts about hygiene this world had never even considered, boiling instruments nobody here thought needed cleaning. Masha grumbled at first about wasting good firewood on boiling rags, then quietly stopped grumbling once the fever counts dropped. Ella, a botanist and nothing close to a healer by training, found herself boiling herbal remedies anyway. She was roped in simply because there was no one else left standing who could be spared for the task. Her fingers, more used to seed catalogs than sickbeds, learned to grind bark and root into paste within a matter of days. Slowly the crisis broke apart at the edges. Fewer fevers spiked through the tent rows each night. The health readouts in Lorien's mind began climbing back toward where they had been before the caravan arrived. Anna, weeks later, was seen walking the quarantine fence line on newly bandaged feet, testing her own weight one careful step at a time. Then Baal delivered another blow, his voice tight with worry as he laid out the numbers. Firewood would run out in 3 days, mountain roads buried too deep in snow to reach fresh timber in time. Sending loggers out in that cold risked losing them exactly the way the blizzard almost had claimed dozens more. Baal laid the problem out plainly, watching Lorien's face for any hint of the solution he clearly did not have yet either. Down in the quarry, bandit slaves struck a strange black substance buried in the rock, certain they had dug into something demonic. Lorien held a torch to it himself, crouched at the tunnel mouth while the miners backed away. It smoldered, reeked faintly of sulfur, and then caught, burning hot and steady in the dark, coal. The miners flinched back from the torch as if the stone itself might curse them for touching it. Instead of freeing the terrified miners, he promoted them, doubled their rations, handed out leather jackets against the cold. He ordered the quarry turned into a full coal mine before the week was even out. The former terror of the tunnels became something closer to a badge of honor among the miners assigned to dig it deeper. The first coal cart rolled into the square, and the town recoiled from a smell they compared to a demon's leavings. Gareth threw a fist-sized lump into a dying fire out of pure curiosity one evening. It flared dark red, throwing off heat so fierce it forced him back several steps with his sleeve half over his face. Chimneys across Greywood began pouring sulfur-tinged smoke into the sky, and for once nobody complained about the smell. The heat inside those houses was saving their lives, and that mattered more than any stink drifting overhead. Children pressed their palms flat against warm stone hearths, delighted by a kind of heat none of them had felt before that winter. Ella was thrilled by the discovery, realizing coal-fed flues could push greenhouse temperatures even higher than before. That opened the door to summer vegetables growing in the dead of winter, something she had not dared hope for. She scribbled new flue diagrams on the back of an old grain ledger, talking to herself the whole time about heat curves and root depth. 6 a.m. arrived once more, coins settling into their now familiar rhythm across the floor. Population 7,587, 7,587 silver coins paid in full. 30 miles from Greywood, a starving green-skinned orc tribe caught the smell of roasted food drifting on the wind. Over 200 strong, they were led by a chief named Grom the Bonebreaker, gaunt and hollow-eyed with hunger. 3 days without meat was enough to decide it. Grom gave the order, and the tribe moved on Greywood at 1 in the morning. His warriors moved low through the frost, weapons wrapped in cloth to keep the steel from catching moonlight. The alarm horn tore through the dark again, its note dragging every sleeping soul upright. Gareth saw the shapes coming across the snow, easily 8 feet tall, and knew immediately these were nothing like the bandits before. His hands shook on the spear shaft for a moment before he forced them still. Pete's fear spiked hard in his chest, but it steadied fast on the same thing that had steadied him in the last battle. A warm bed and full meals were worth fighting to keep, and he gripped his spear tighter with that thought alone. 500 iron guards locked into formation, spears angled at 45 degrees, boots planted in the frozen mud. The orcs smashed straight through the wooden perimeter fence, splinters flying in every direction. The ground shook under the weight of charging orc feet, and dust rose even through the packed snow. Steel spearheads punched through orc hide that had shrugged off lesser weapons for years without a scratch. Lorien gave the order that had already become his signature on any battlefield. Hamstring them, take them alive, no unnecessary killing, he shouted over the din of steel and screaming. Dead citizens meant lost income, plain and simple. Living captives meant a labor force that never stopped paying dividends. Iron guards adjusted their spear angles mid-swing at the shouted order, aiming low instead of true. Under an hour later, the fighting sputtered out and finally stopped altogether. 120 orc bodies lay outside the walls, steam still rising off them into the cold air. Roughly 80 survivors, Grom among them, knelt chained in the snow, breath fogging in ragged bursts. Baal urged execution, calling the orcs mindless, man-eating beasts unworthy of even a scrap of mercy. He kept his distance from Grom's chain bulk even as he argued, old fear still written plainly across his face. Lorien saw something else entirely in the kneeling ranks in front of him. Cold immune, low pain, cheap to feed excavators, perfectly built for the brutal work of coal mining. And under the system's rules, captured orcs counted exactly like every other slave, generating passive silver income every single day. At sword point, Grom's own finger pressed the ownership mark into the register, ink smudging across scarred green skin. The system confirmed it without hesitation. 82 new orc slave citizens, population now 7,669. Grom stared at the food set in front of him instead of a headsman's axe. He could not process why his enemy would choose to feed him rather than simply end him where he knelt. Steam rose off the bowl in front of him, and for a long moment he simply stared at it without moving. All 82 orcs were marched straight to the coal mine the very next morning, chains clinking in the cold. Human miners eyed them warily at first, keeping a careful distance until the first shift ended without incident. At the blacksmith shop, 5 furnaces strained and failed to reach the heat needed to properly melt pig iron. Sparks hissed and died against the anvil, and the apprentices exchanged tired glances after the third failed batch. They produced nothing but brittle, low-grade fake steel that snapped under the lightest test. Master Smith Copperhammer warned that raw coal, if used directly, would only make the metal worse, riddled with hidden cracks. Lorien crouched in the snow beside him and sketched a diagram with a stick, lines scratched roughly into the frost. Sealed earthen kilns, he explained, could bake coal without air, burning off the sulfur and leaving behind something purer. Copperhammer listened with narrowed eyes, then started digging into the frozen ground with his bare hands before Lorien finished talking. 3 days later, orc-powered bellows drove the new coke fuel to a white-hot burn inside those kilns. Pig iron melted fully for the very first time in Greywood's history, glowing and pouring like something alive. The glow off the molten metal lit his face orange, and for once his usual scowl gave way entirely. Copperhammer wept over the crucible as though it held holy water rather than molten metal. Lorien tested a freshly forged steel blade against the finest purchased iron spear in his armory. The steel cut clean through the spear shaft without a single mark on its own edge. He ordered every old weapon in the town melted down and reforged in real steel from that day forward. Word of the blade's edge spread through the Iron Guard barracks within a day, men lining up to trade in their old spears. Mars, sensing profit the moment he saw the coal, proposed selling it raw straight to Redleaf's nobility. He suggested a price 10 to 20 times the going rate of firewood. Certain nobles would pay anything for warmth. Lorien shut it down instantly, cutting Mars off mid-sentence. A coal vein that valuable would draw Redleaf's 800 knights and every allied baron in the region like blood in the water. Mars' face fell for a moment before he recovered, nodding along as the safer, subtler plan replaced his own. His solution was subtler by far. Crush the coal to powder, mix it with clay and deodorizing herbs, and press it into disguised bricks. Pressed and dried, the bricks looked almost ordinary, dull black rectangles stacked in crates lined with straw. Nobody would be able to trace the bricks back to their true source, no matter how closely they look. Marketed as a mysterious alchemical relic pulled from northern ruins, the briquettes sold only to castle-owning nobles. The split ran 70% to Lorien and 30% to Mars, a deal both men considered more than fair. The briquettes became an overnight sensation, fetching 2 silver coins apiece across Red Leaf's upper circles. Profit laundered straight through the Chamber of Commerce's books, clean and untraceable on paper. Mars kept a private tally of the split in a locked drawer, checking it more often than a man his age probably should have. But sensations draw eyes, and Red Leaf's chief political officer, a man named Victor, arrived at Greywood's border in an unmarked carriage. Elite cavalry rode in tow behind him, hooves crunching over packed snow. He came expecting to inspect a wasteland, some pitiful frozen backwater not worth a second look. Instead he found tidy wooden houses, clean streets, and the roar of blast furnaces lighting the horizon orange. His guard captain was stopped cold by 20 iron guards wearing steel chainmail hidden under ragged leather. Their boots were polished, their formation tight, and not one of them so much as glanced away from the visiting captain. They wielded cross swords sharper than anything in the Duke's own personal guard, and did not flinch under his gaze. Lorien met him in a fitted black outfit, flanked by armed men and 2 massive orc overseers gripping steel warhammers. He simply invited Victor in for tea, framing the whole conversation as a discussion about a profitable little business venture. That morning's payout landed right on schedule as they walked, coins already settling somewhere behind closed doors. Population 8,105. 8,105 silver coins accounted for in full. A fire crackled in the hearth behind them, throwing long shadows across a room far tidier than Victor had expected to find. In the study, over steaming cups neither man touched, Victor tiptoed around the true purpose of his visit. He hinted that his Viscount had grown suspicious about the source of these mysterious warm stones circulating the city. Lorien answered with total honesty, almost disarmingly so, admitting he controlled a massive fuel vein. Then he slammed a steel dagger down on the table between them, the sound sharp in the quiet room. If Red Leaf tried to seize it by force, he warned, he would destroy the mine himself before losing it. He promised to take heavy losses out of their knights on the way down, and meant every word. Outside the window, an orc overseer walked past carrying a warhammer that looked heavy enough to fell a wall on its own. The dagger's point sat close enough to the teacup that Victor did not dare reach for it again. Victor's composure cracked visibly at the threat, his hand tightening around his untouched cup. Lorien softened just as fast, sliding a heavy iron box across the table toward him. 2,000 silver coins, framed politely as a mineral tax and a personal travel bribe rolled into one. The deal was struck there in that quiet room. 20% of coal profits paid to Red Leaf as legal tax. In exchange, Greywood received official protection and legitimacy it had never held before. Victor signed the paperwork with visible relief, as though he had expected to leave that room with far less than he actually walked out with. Privately, Lorien barely blinked at the cut he had agreed to hand over. His true income came from the system itself, untouched and guaranteed no matter what tribute he paid on paper. He intended to reclaim every coin of that tribute with interest, once his army had grown large enough to demand it back. For now, 20% bought silence, and silence bought time to grow larger than anyone watching from the capital realized. With population past 8,000 and basic survival no longer in question, Lorien noticed something dangerous creeping in. Comfort had arrived, and with it, the first whispers of complacency among people who had only just stopped starving. He noticed it first in small things, a wasted crust here, a shift skipped there, the kind of laziness only safety could afford. He abolished the free rations that had kept the town alive all winter, a move that made Baal certain riots were about to erupt. Instead, Lorien opened a full marketplace: flour, meat, salt, sheepskin coats, cheap liquor, all for sale. All of it paid for with the wages people were already earning through their own labor. Baal watched the first market day unfold with genuine confusion, unable to see at first why any of it would work in Lorien's favor. Money that flowed out in wages now flowed straight back through the market stalls, cycling into his own pocket. Stalls sprang up along the main road within days, canvas awnings snapping in the wind, vendors calling out prices for salted fish and dyed wool. People worked themselves willingly exhausted, never noticing the coin looping back to where it started. Pete spent his first market wage on a proper knife for his mother, turning it over in his hands before he even paid for it. Lorien told Baal, flatly and without apology, that real exploitation was never the whip. It was making people grateful for the privilege of working themselves to the bone every single day. Baal turned the phrase over for a long moment, unsure whether to be disturbed by it or impressed. He settled, eventually, on both and said nothing further on the subject for the rest of the evening. By late February the snow began to thin at last, dripping off the eaves in slow, steady lines. Ella burst in carrying fresh greenhouse vegetables, grown twice as fast under coal-fed heat and custom compost. Lorien immediately saw an opening in the leafy bundle she dropped on his table. Winter nobles suffered brutally from scurvy, bleeding gums, ulcerated skin, and no fresh greens for months at a stretch. He packed the first crates in temperature-controlled boxes and rushed them straight to Red Leaf City. He had Ella wrap each bundle in damp cloth to keep the leaves glossy and fresh, looking for the long ride into the city. He branded them the miraculous leaf of life, supposedly harvested from an elf forest, and priced them at 1 silver coin a leaf. Population 8,521. Earnings 8,521 silver coins. Servants set the crate down carefully, as if it might shatter, while the room fell into an odd, hungry hush. At Red Leaf Castle, the nobility, gums bleeding and skin raw from the long winter, stared at the vegetables like a cure sent from heaven itself. Mars claimed mercenaries had died retrieving them, spinning the story thicker with every telling. He described a nighttime raid past elven wards that grew more dramatic each time a noble leaned in to listen. He offered the first basket to the Viscount himself, bowing low as he presented it. When Victor reached for gold, up to 100 coins offered without hesitation, Mars revealed the true price was something else entirely. 100 healthy skilled serfs, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, for a single basket of leaves, no gold accepted. Victor's counsel argued for an hour before agreeing, desperate enough for a cure that the price stopped mattering. One elderly noblewoman reportedly wept at the first bite, her gums finally free of the ache that had plagued her all winter. Back home, Baal questioned why Lorien would trade valuable greens for what he considered a burden of extra mouths. Simple gold seemed so much cleaner to him than another crowd of strangers to feed in-house. Lorien laid it out over a map spread across the table, tracing supply lines with one finger. He tapped the map twice for emphasis, tracing the border where any blockade would first take hold. Gold meant nothing if Red Leaf simply cut his supply lines one day. People farmed, mined, forged, and fought, each one a guaranteed daily coin for as long as they lived under his banner. He planned to drain skilled labor out of every neighboring territory using vegetables as bait. His goal was population past 10,000 before spring even fully arrived, and he intended to hit it early. Baal simply shook his head at the map, no longer bothering to argue with numbers he had stopped fully understanding. Instead he asked, quietly, how many more wagons he should ready for the coming season, and left it at that. With enemies circling and his ambitions climbing steadily, Lorien pushed the blacksmiths and coal operation harder still. He worried, quietly, that he was running short on the raw firepower his growing empire would eventually need to survive. Spring planting began at last, mud thawing into something workable underfoot. Over 1,000 new serfs, arrivals from the vegetable for labor trade, saw Greywood's fields for the very first time. A new serf named Hans stood frozen watching a steel plow, over 200 kilograms of it, cut across the frost. It was pulled not by oxen but by 2 massive orcs straining in leather harness, muscles bunched under green skin. Clumps of black earth flew up behind the blade, and Hans just stood there with his mouth open until someone shoved a hoe into his hands. The plow tore through frozen earth at a trotting horse's pace, clearing in minutes what a family once spent a full day breaking by hand. Ella walked the rows behind them, directing serfs to sow compost-soaked wheat seeds straight into the fresh furrows. Hans and the others wept openly at the sight, crying out long life to their lord as though he were something more than a man. The scent of turned earth carried up the hillside on a mild breeze, the first real hint of spring after a brutal winter. He watched the furrows lengthen row by row, mentally converting every acre into wheat and every sack of wheat into more citizens. Lorien watched from a hillside, cold and certain, already convinced that capital's expansion had no ceiling at all. 6 months earlier, far from any of this, the Bohemia family had collapsed entirely in a political struggle back home. The rival Duke of the Golden Lion had seized every last one of their holdings in the aftermath. The takeover had been swift and thorough, sweeping through estates, ledgers, and titles within a matter of weeks. To that Duke, Lorien was a discarded exile, not worth a second thought. He was a rounding error in a much larger conquest that had already moved on to bigger targets. Word eventually reached the capital that this same exile now sat on a mysterious fuel source, and a fortune nobody could explain. The Duke ordered quiet economic pressure first, testing the waters before committing to anything louder. His agents leaned on merchants and grain brokers alike, hoping to starve the exile out before anyone even noticed the effort. Then he sent assassins, convinced Lorien's own mother was secretly funding a revenge plot from the shadows of the household. Lorien's sister, Serena, still trapped inside the Bohemia household, begged their mother to help him. She said the words without looking up from her own correspondence, as though the matter had already been settled long ago. Their mother refused coldly, calling him worthless, trash not worth the risk of drawing the Duke's attention their way. So Serena acted alone, quietly and against every instruction she had been given. She pressed the coin purse into Sylvie's palm herself, hands trembling as she whispered instructions no one else in the house could hear. She sent her own trusted bodyguard, a silver-haired knight named Sylvie, north with every coin she had managed to save. Sylvie fought off 3 separate mercenary ambushes on the road alone, blade wet more than once before Grywood came into view. Her cloak was torn at the shoulder from the last ambush, and dried blood, none of it hers, still darkened one sleeve. She had not slept properly in 3 days, running mostly on cold rations and the memory of Serena's worried face. She expected to find a decrepit slum and a cowering exile waiting at the end of the journey. Instead she rode into a walled industrial town, chimneys smoking against the sky, patrols marching in step. She reined in her horse hard, certain for a moment she had ridden into the wrong territory entirely. Orcs hauled steel plows through open fields nearby, and she was surrounded by an Iron Guard patrol within minutes of arriving. Lorien, half amused by the sight of her, conscripted her on the spot as his personal bodyguard. He warned her that acting without orders would cost her life, mostly just to see how she would react to the threat. Sylvie did not so much as blink at the threat, which told him more about her than any answer could have. Sylvie answered the test by delivering the real reason she had come all this way. Red Leaf and 3 neighboring barons had formed a commercial blockade, cutting off grain, salt and pig iron starting the very next day. Refugees would be blocked at every border from now on, turned back at spear point if necessary. Her voice stayed level even as she listed each threat, the same calm drilled into her from years of guard duty. A bandit raid was already being planned, she added, to finish what the blockade itself would start. Lorien laughed the threat off entirely, waving a hand as though swatting away a fly. His own wheat, his own steel, his own salt meant the blockade would starve them, not him, and he said so plainly. He listed each resource off with a small satisfied nod, as though checking items off a shopping list rather than counting weapons. His counter was already forming in his head as she spoke. Flood their territories with ultra-cheap steel tools, bankrupting their economy from the inside without a single blade ever drawn. She had trained her whole life for swordplay, and here was a man planning to win without ever drawing a blade. Sylvie was visibly stunned by the sheer coldness of an economic weapon built to gut an enemy without ever meeting them on a battlefield. Then she delivered the sharper warning she had been saving, her voice dropping lower. 3 second-tier assassins had already slipped into town under cover of trade caravans. Lorien's reaction was almost gleeful, already picturing skilled killers as free labor once they were caught alive. Sylvie's eyebrows rose slightly at the response, still adjusting to a lord who treated assassination attempts like recruitment opportunities. That night, the 3 assassins crept into Lorien's supposed bedroom, floorboards silent under practiced feet. The 3 moved without a sound, boards that should have creaked staying strangely silent under their weight. They buried their blades in a decoy instead, a scarecrow rigged with scrap metal hidden under the blankets. Lorien revealed himself on a roof beam beside Sylvie a heartbeat later, cloak shifting in the dark. The assassins spun toward the sudden sound above them, blades already coming up defensively. He hurled a homemade device, lime and magnesium powder and coal dust, that erupted into blinding light on impact. Gareth led 50 iron guards armed with steel crossbows into the chaos, shooting the assassins through the legs to bring them down alive. Lorien inspected the strongest of the 3 like a man appraising livestock at auction. He ordered his Achilles tendon cut and sent him to the mines in iron shackles before the sun rose. The other 2, less useful for their build, were marched off to the same fate without any pretense of ceremony. The 2 remaining assassins were dragged off cursing, dropped in irons alongside their companion before the sun had fully risen. Sylvie watched, horrified and impressed in equal measure, by how efficiently he had turned attempted murder into free skilled labor. Lorien promised Red Leaf City a gift the very next day, and meant every word of it, despite the strangeness of the phrase. He had the seized assassin daggers melted down alongside cheap pig iron rather than kept as evidence. He was unwilling to risk an open accusation backfiring on him if the blades ever surfaced again. Copper hammer melted them down without a single question, treating royal forged steel no differently than any other scrap. To Sylvie, he explained his philosophy plainly, counting points off on his fingers as he spoke. Quiet economic strangulation beats open confrontation every single time, he told her, and she found she could not argue. She began from that day, watching the ledgers with the same attention she had once reserved for enemy troop movements. It was, she realized slowly, a different kind of battlefield, one measured in coin and contracts instead of blood. The blacksmiths went to work mass-producing hoes, pots, nails, and sickles from high-grade steel. Each piece cost under 5 copper coins to make, where inferior local tools cost 30 to 50 just to buy. Mars sold them across Red Leaf territory for just 15 copper coins each, a deliberate flood meant to bankrupt local blacksmiths within a single month. Sylvie understood the endgame instantly, turning the plan over in her head as the wagons rolled out. No local smiths left standing meant no one able to repair Red Leaf's armor or forge new weapons when war finally came. Wagon after wagon rolled south loaded with crates stamped in No Guild's mark, undercutting shops that had stood for generations. Drivers were told to smile, take payment quietly, and answer no questions about where any of it had actually been forged. Lorien's next target was the Viscount's own castle, hooked slowly on subsidized steel tableware and horseshoes. The trap would not close all at once. It would close quietly, one convenient purchase at a time. Nobles who once sneered at Greywood's name were now quietly ordering its steel plates for their own dinner tables. Servants delivered the crates through back doors after dark, careful not to let the wrong guest notice the shipment. By mid-April, population had crossed 10,000, and the system flagged something new in his mind. 85% management chaos, quietly bleeding 15% off his daily income without him even noticing at first. Illiterate serfs and knotted rope record-keeping simply could not coordinate production at this scale anymore. Lorien launched mandatory night classes for team leaders, Iron Guard officers, and mine supervisors. Failure meant demotion straight to coal hauling, a threat that emptied every excuse for skipping a lesson. Grown men who had never held a stick of chalk sat cramped on benches after long shifts, tracing letters with cracked, calloused fingers. Some fell asleep mid-lesson, chalk still gripped loosely in their fists, and had to be shaken awake by their neighbors. Ella chalked numbers onto a board for anyone willing to learn, her voice patient even after long field days. Sylvie drilled military discipline into the same rooms, using the flat of her blade to keep backs straight. None of it was about enlightenment for its own sake. Lorien wanted literate foremen who could manage thousands of illiterate laborers and erase that chaos penalty entirely. He sat in on one session himself, correcting a supervisor's sums with the flat patience of a man who had done this math in his sleep before. Ella caught herself smiling once at how quickly hands picked up the multiplication tables she scratched onto the board. 2 weeks into the dumping campaign, Red Leaf's Viscount raged through his own castle, boots echoing off stone. 9 of 12 blacksmith shops in his city had already gone bankrupt, shutters nailed shut over cold forges. His knights' swords were snapping in practice drills, and even bandits carried sharper edges than his own men now. A page brought him another broken blade on a velvet cushion, and the Viscount hurled it across the room without a word. It clattered off a tapestry and landed in 2 pieces, a small metaphor for everything else falling apart around him. Farm tools bought second-hand through markets Greywood itself supplied had somehow outclassed royal steel. Victor explained the trap fully, laying it out as gently as he could manage under the circumstances. The Golden Eagle chamber had cornered quality ore, and the apprentices left standing barely remembered how real forging worked anymore. Victor spread the numbers across the council table, watching them land one by one like fresh blows on an already bruised man. The Viscount ordered the cheap ironware banned outright, slamming a fist onto his own council table. Victor told him plainly it was unenforceable, since even his own barons were secretly buying it themselves. They bought Greywood's coal and vegetables too, he added, whether the ban existed or not. The Viscount pressed his palms against his temples, the sound of his own castle's decline suddenly impossible to ignore. Then worse news landed on the Viscount's desk before he could even process the first blow. The Duke of the Golden Lion's special envoy had gone missing near Greywood's border, apparently kidnapped without a trace. It was, of course, entirely orchestrated by Lorien himself from start to finish. He was already holding the pampered envoy, a baron named Philip, under iron guard watch in a locked cellar. He had traveled with 2 guards and a servant, none of whom put up much resistance once the ambush closed around them. Philip had arrived expecting an escort of honor, and instead found himself dragged off his horse before he understood what was happening. He spent the first night shouting for his title to be respected, until an orc guard simply set a whetstone against a blade until he stopped. By morning his voice had gone hoarse, and he sat quietly, watching the door for any sign of who might come through it next. A bowl of plain porridge was slid under the door twice a day, and he ate it every time despite swearing at first that he would refuse. Lorien's framing of the whole affair was almost lazy in its confidence when word finally reached Red Leaf. He had simply rescued Philip from bandits, he claimed, and protection, naturally, came at a price. Messengers carried the story south dressed up with just enough detail to sound plausible, and just enough vagueness to be unprovable. No one in Redleaf's court thought to question a rescue story that arrived alongside a very reasonable-sounding invoice. In a basement lit by a single lantern, the terrified envoy sat bound while Lorien calmly filed his nails. He insisted he needed a security fee equal to the value of Redleaf's entire iron mine, and said it without raising his voice once. Philip's head snapped up at the number, disbelief plain on his face even through days of grime and exhaustion. He opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it when an orc guard shifted its weight near the door. Victor rode through the night to reach him, horse lathered white, begging Lorien not to seize the mine outright. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, the exhaustion of the ride catching up with him at last. He warned it could mean open war between their territories, a war Redleaf could no longer hope to win. Lorien countered coldly, ticking off the reasons on his fingers one at a time. Redleaf had no army left worth fielding, blacksmiths broken, armor unrepairable, and morale gutted from within. He let each point land before moving to the next, watching Victor's face for the moment resistance finally broke. The lantern between them guttered once, throwing both their faces briefly into shadow before settling again. If this reached the capital, he added, the Duke would punish the Viscount regardless of what happened here tonight. Then he offered a way out, sliding the terms across the table like a peace offering. Sign the mine over as a mortgage transfer, get the envoy back unharmed, and receive discounted tools and coal going forward. Trembling, Victor signed his name at the bottom of the page, ink blotting slightly under his shaking hand. A guard even handed him a clean cloak for the ride, an oddly courteous gesture after days of captivity. Philip was released at the border an hour later, given back his horse and a polite escort as though nothing at all had happened. He rode home without once looking back at the walls that had held him, too rattled to even try composing a version of events that made him look brave. Greywood's heavy industry became fully self-sufficient in iron that very day, the last dependency severed for good. Back home, the night classes paid off in a way even Lorien had not fully expected. And now literate hands correctly calculated ore consumption quotas, earning a promotion that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Team leaders produced Greywood's first standardized quota tables, columns neat and legible for the first time. Lorien handed out measuring tools and ledgers with a blunt warning that faked records would be punished severely. The next morning management chaos dropped to a healthy 12%, wiping out the 15% tax penalty entirely. Full income landed on schedule, 10,582 silver coins, matching the population count exactly. Lorien stacked the coins into neat towers on his desk that morning, counting the height instead of the total for once, just to see it grow. Bull watched from the doorway, no longer bothering to ask how any of this had become normal to him. Sylvie arrived with urgent news that made even Lorien's calm falter for a moment, her boots still caked with road mud. Redleaf's Viscount, driven half-mad by his losses, had sold off gold and jewelry to hire 400 mercenaries. Combined with 800 knights and 1,300 armed serfs, it added up to a 2,500-man army. They marched with battering rams and oil, aiming to burn Greywood to the ground before the night was through. Sylvie described the columns stretching back along the road farther than she could see from the ridge where she had counted them. Torchlight flickered along their ranks for miles, a slow river of fire creeping toward Greywood in the dark. Lorien was not worried, waving off most of the report as he studied a map instead. He dismissed most of the force as underfed serfs and poorly equipped mercenaries not worth the fear Sylvie clearly felt. Sylvie pushed back hard, reminding him that 300 fully armored knights charging in formation remained a genuine threat. No matter how confident he felt sitting behind his own walls, she insisted the danger was real. He nodded after a moment, conceding the point, and turned the conversation from confidence to preparation without missing a beat. Copperhammer was summoned before Sylvie had even finished her report, already halfway through a list of what the forge could supply overnight. Instead of meeting them blade to blade, Lorien mobilized 3,000 laborers overnight. They dug zigzagging trenches, 2 meters deep, 500 meters outside the town, shovels working through the dark. Lanterns dotted the field like fallen stars, and the sound of digging carried for miles across the still night air. Copperhammer's team hammered stakes into the trench walls by feel, cursing softly at every splinter and blister. Copperhammer's team strarmed wire behind the trenches and seeded the ground with iron caltrops. Lorien called it a meat grinder built specifically for cavalry, and meant the description literally. He stationed 1,000 hidden iron guard crossbowmen behind it, bowstrings taut in the cold night air. Grom crouched among his own men, axe resting across his knees, watching the tree line with the patience of a hunter who had waited for worse. None of the orcs spoke, communicating in small gestures they had picked up from months of working the mines together. Orc squads waited in the trench bottoms below, steel axes ready and breath held against the frost. That night, 300 Red Leaf Knights charged in the dark, certain the town lay undefended before them. They slammed straight into invisible barbed wire at full speed, the impact throwing riders from their saddles. Horses went down screaming, a sound that carried far across the frozen field. Metal rang against metal in the dark as men and horses tangled together in the wire, unable to tell friend from ground. Somewhere behind the front rank, a knight's helmet rolled loose across frozen earth, catching the faint moonlight as it spun. Riders were thrown clear or pitched straight into the waiting trenches below, armor clattering against stone. Lorien gave the order from his position on the rise, and the hidden crossbows opened fire on the wreckage below. Wire shredded horseflesh in the dark, and men who survived the fall found caltrops waiting to pierce boots and thighs. The trench walls trapped every scream, turning the ditch into a narrow corridor no soldier could climb out of in time. Mud Swallow dropped weapons whole, and more than one soldier scrabbled uselessly at slick clay walls that refused to give him purchase. Those who tumbled into the trenches met Grom and his orc warriors swinging heavy steel axes in a space too cramped to fight back. Watching from the rear, the Viscount stared in horror at the carnage unfolding below him. His mouth went dry watching 300 armored knights, the pride of his house, dismantled inside of minutes. An aide beside him tried to speak and found no words came, staring at the same wreckage with equal disbelief. He was certain this had to be sorcery, nothing else could explain a trap laid this precisely in advance. Lorien called it simply a generational gap when the account reached him later, and ordered saturation crossbow volleys to finish it. 2 volleys of rapid reload crossbow fire cut down more than 200 mercenaries and serf soldiers where they stood. Crossbow bolts hissed past in overlapping waves, timed so there was never a gap for the mercenaries to regroup inside. Men who dropped their weapons and raised empty hands were pulled aside rather than cut down, a mercy few of them expected. The rest broke formation and ran, abandoning weapons in the churned mud behind them. Lorien ordered his troops to capture, not kill the fleeing survivors wherever possible. He offered 5 copper coins per laborer captured, and 10 for every live warhorse recovered from the field. Iron guards fanned out across the churned mud, calling the offer into the dark for any survivor still hiding in the wreckage to hear. A few crawled out from under fallen horses at the sound of coin promised, hands raised before they had even fully stood. Sylvie rode down the fleeing Viscount personally, hooves throwing up frozen clods behind her. The horse screamed and went down in a heap, and the Viscount was thrown clear before he even understood what had happened to him. She severed his horse's leg with a single strike and pinned him face down in the mud with a dagger at his throat. Within the hour, an entire 2,500-man army had ceased to exist as a fighting force of any kind. The captured armor was melted down by morning, furnaces roaring through what remained of the night. The surviving mercenaries and serfs were chained and marched straight to the coal mines as new slaves. By sunrise the field held nothing but wreckage, wire, and the slow work of gathering everything that could still be salvaged. Serfs picked through the mud for anything of value, boots, buckles, unbroken spearheads, sorting the haul into careful piles. Lorien threw himself into brutal daily training with Sylvie after that, taking beating after beating without complaint. Bruises bloomed dark across his ribs within the first week, and he wore them without once asking for a lighter pace. Gareth caught him limping across the courtyard once and simply nodded in approval, no words needed between them. He demanded to go again every single time he was knocked down, refusing to stay on the ground for long. His body was changing under the strain, softness burning away into something leaner, harder, built for exactly this kind of world. In one sparring match he lost cleanly on skill alone, blade knocked from his hand within seconds. Then he revealed the tricks hiding underneath his obvious loss. A blinding powder throw flung from his sleeve. A retractable boot blade aimed at her calf followed it, and a wrist-mounted mini crossbow leveled at her chest a moment later. It forced a draw out of pure improvisation, breath ragged on both sides by the end of it. Sylvie found herself approving of a fighting style built on ruthlessness rather than honor, whatever that said about her. She began sparring him twice a day after that, curious how many more tricks were hidden somewhere under his sleeves. Neither of them mentioned it, but the sessions had started running longer than either training or duty strictly required. In the basement below, the humiliated Viscount and Envoy Philip sat stripped and tied back to back. Orcs stood nearby quietly sharpening knives, the sound of stone on steel filling the silence between them. Lorien laid out a 3-clause contract in plain, unhurried language. Red Leaf's territory would open emigration to Greywood without obstruction, no exceptions and no delays. It would also waive all customs duties for Greywood and the Golden Eagle Chamber going forward. Finally, it would pay 1,000 gold coins in compensation for the barbed wire his men had ruined charging through it. Threatened with what the orcs cheerfully called surgery, the Viscount signed through tears, hand shaking so badly the ink smeared. Philip signed his own copy right beside him, no longer bothering to protest a single clause of it. An orc guard walked both documents to the door personally, as if daring anyone to suggest the ink might not be permanent. With Red Leaf's Knights broken, Greywood's scribes flooded the surrounding villages with cheap steel scythes and printed flyers. The flyers promised wheat porridge, paid work, orc-plowed fields, and free lessons in reading to anyone willing to walk. Village elders read the flyers aloud in market squares across Red Leaf territory, and within days entire households began packing carts. Some left behind land their families had worked for generations without so much as a backward glance at the empty fields. The exodus that followed was staggering in scale. Population surged from 10,582 toward 15,420. It kept climbing still further, toward 18,900, as more villages emptied out toward Greywood's gates. The road into town stayed clogged with carts and walking families for weeks, dust rising over the horizon every single morning. Registration lines at the gates stretched from dawn until well past dusk, thumbprints stamped by the hundreds each day. Lorien watched daily earnings creep toward 20,000 silver coins, delighted at how efficiently his machine kept devouring numbers. Across the fields, the whole territory had begun to look less like a lord's estate and more like a factory floor stretched over open country. Smokestacks, plow lines, and marching patrols had replaced the empty silence that once defined this stretch of land entirely. Travelers passing through swore the noise alone could be heard from a full day's ride away on a clear morning. Gareth, once a one-legged beggar carrying his granddaughter through the snow, now commanded thousands under a banner he had helped design himself. His granddaughter ran the drill yards freely now, safe enough that no one blinked when she wandered among armed men. She had grown taller over the winter, and could now recite the names of every officer under her grandfather's command by heart. Pete had grown from a terrified farmhand into a hardened Iron Guard officer, his voice carrying easily across a drill yard. His mother Martha was finally sleeping through a winter without fear for the first time in her life. She kept a jar of coins on the windowsill now, not because she needed to hide it, but because she liked watching it fill up. Pete teased her about it once, and she swatted him with a dish towel hard enough to make the point permanently. Ella's fenced fields had become the most productive acreage on the entire continent, envied by farmers who had never met her. Her name was whispered with something close to reverence among the serfs she had once distrusted on sight. She had stopped flinching whenever Lorien entered her greenhouses, trading suspicion for something closer to grudging respect. Even Kyle, once a bandit with nothing left to lose, now oversaw fellow miners with a loyalty that would have been unthinkable a year before. He had traded his scar-earned nickname for a foreman's ledger, and seemed prouder of the ledger. Grom's orcs, feared as monsters everywhere else on the continent, worked the mines and the fields without complaint. They had become the backbone of an economy that had somehow learned to feed even its own enemies. Grom himself had taken to correcting new orc arrivals on mining technique, a strange kind of authority he had never expected to hold. Every one of them, willingly or not, had become part of the same growing machine. Every one of them believed, in their own way, that Lorien had personally saved their life, and none of them were entirely wrong. In the capital, none of that mattered to the man watching his own plans collapse in real time behind closed doors. He read the same dispatch twice, certain the numbers had to be a clerical error before accepting they were not. His knuckles whitened around the edge of the report before he finally set it down and called for his advisors. Duke Goldenlion sat with reports confirming that his 2,500-man proxy army had failed completely. His special envoy scheme had failed alongside it, both against a man he still refused to call anything but an exiled cripple. His intelligence spoke of things that made no sense on their own, no matter how many times he read the reports. Repeating crossbows, armor better than his own guards, orc soldiers fighting under a noble's banner instead of raiding against one. None of it matched anything his own military advisors had ever seen documented on this continent before. One scout swore under oath that the crossbows fired faster than any weapon he had trained against in 20 years of service. He could not explain any of it without assuming a hidden, powerful backer was pulling strings from somewhere in the shadows. He summoned his advisors twice in 1 week, demanding answers none of them could actually provide him. Every theory they offered sounded more desperate than the last, until one advisor suggested the church might succeed where armies had not. So he decided to stop fighting Lorien with armies at all, and start fighting him with faith instead. His plan was to use the Church of Light itself as a weapon no trench or spear could stop. A church envoy sat across from him, nodding along as the Duke described black smoke and orc labor as evidence enough of sin. The envoy's fingers traced the edge of his own holy symbol as he listened, already composing the language of the charge in his head. He would declare Lorien a heretic who commanded demons and pulled blasphemous black stones from the earth. A heresy charge would strip Greywood of every legal protection it held, across every kingdom on the continent, all at once. No mine deal, no tax agreement, no signed contract would matter once the church declared a man an enemy of the light itself. The Duke allowed himself, for the first time in months, something close to a smile at the thought of it. Sylvie warned Lorien this threat was nothing like the last one he had faced. Armies could be met with trenches and steel, she said, but a heresy charge could turn the entire world against him without a single blade drawn. Her hand rested on her sword hilt out of habit, though she already understood a blade would be useless against this particular enemy. Lorien listened without interrupting, weighing the warning against everything he had already built to withstand it. Lorien only laughed, unbothered by the warning, and ordered something he had been quietly building in secret to be wheeled out at last. Dust rose as the last of the tarps came off, and the assembled crowd went quiet at the sight of so much strange machinery in one place. Canvas sheeting fell away to reveal rows of tiny lead letters set into wooden frames, each one cast and filed by hand over weeks of secret work. A movable type printing press stood revealed in the lamplight, designed by Copper Hammer from little more than a description in Lorien's head. His plan was simple and enormous in scope, the kind of idea that only made sense to a man who thought in numbers. Print 100,000 copies of a single document, the Declaration of the Emancipation of the Workers of Greywood Town. Put it into the hands of every serf on the continent who could now, thanks to him, finally read it for themselves. Copper Hammer ran a trial page through the press, ink smearing thick and even across the paper as the frame lifted away clean. He held the sheet up to the lamplight, squinting at rows of letters he still could not fully read himself. Somewhere far to the south, the Church of Light was already drafting its own declaration in candlelit halls. It was one meant to brand him a monster and erase everything he had built with a single carefully chosen word. Candle wax dripped onto half-finished parchment as clerks worked through the night, racing toward a deadline only the Duke had set. Every crossed-out line was rewritten harsher than the last, the language sharpening with each new draft. Two machines were about to go to war with each other, one built from ink and paper, the other from scripture and fear. Only one of them was going to come out the other side, still standing when the dust finally settled. Whichever machine won, the continent itself was never going to look the same again. Ball stood beside the press that night, watching Lorien's face in the lamplight, and finally understood he was serving something bigger than a lord.